You had a question you wanted to ask before?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Is it ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So you gave a lecture a little while ago about evolution, and a question about that. I believe your argument was similar to one that Gulden 1 talked about in the spandrels of San Marco or something. It kind of is also kind of similar, I think, to like Joey Fodder's argument, the critique of natural selection as a mechanism. And I'm curious, even though we may not be able to say why X species or why this X species has a Y trait, the reason why that trait is the most advantageous, why aren't we able to say that that still is caused by natural selection, since you can notice a bunch of traits, let's say existing, or mutations existing, and certain traits that are more advantageous, or let's say through survival of the fittest, seem to, in a way, kind of outbeat those other traits, then why are we able to say that, yeah, we may not know why that species has that trait, but we could still say it because of natural selection.
Yeah, I'm almost positive you're confusing me with somebody else. I don't think I ever mentioned spandrels.
You mentioned Nagel, though, in his book. Right?
Well, yes, but it's a 100-page book, and he says lots and lots and lots of things, and I didn't mention that point in particular. I've never used that point as a point of argument, so I don't know why you're expecting an answer from me on this question. But I will point out, in the way you expressed yourself now, you made a slide from one idea to another, which is a very common slide to make, which has to be very carefully guarded against. The question is whether I should accept the idea that natural selection accounts for the existence of certain traits. Now, the starting point for the discussion is, I say to a believer in evolution, I have no position for or against. I'm just trying to become educated. You say you know what the reason is. That means you have some evidence for it, some convincing argument that's correct. I'm interested in hearing the convincing argument that it is correct. But you didn't do that. You slid to, why can't I say that it's natural selection? Why can't I? That invites me to give an argument against you. That wasn't the program. The program was for you to give a positive argument that it's true. What you have done is gone from taking the responsibility to show that it's true and moved to showing that it's possible. I agree it's possible. I think leprechauns are possible. Possibility is a giveaway. We're not interested in what's possible. We're interested in what we have adequate reason to believe because there's positive evidence in its favor. No one is required to show that natural selection is wrong. The believer in natural selection is required to show that it's correct. And against that, there's lots and lots of evidence. But that slide, that's a defensive slide to put the burden of proof on the other party, which in logic is just not valid. Be very careful about that. Yeah.
What you just said about burden of proof, how would you describe what's called common sense in that regard?
I use the phrase burden of proof, but the truth is, if you look at my book, I'm against the word proof in general. Even though someone pointed out to me that you can weasel out of it, you can talk about, as they do in criminal law in America, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not a proof, because there's a possible doubt, it's just not a reasonable doubt. Okay, common sense can be reason. How strong the reason is depends upon the context, but common sense is not nothing. After all, you use common sense to solve a lot of your problems, and you're pretty good at solving your problems, otherwise you'd be dead. So common sense can't be dismissed. In fact, I don't think any category can be dismissed. You have to use them selectively, and you have to use them on the basis of how well they fit with other things that you know. But the question of burden is, because it's not really relevant here, let me explain what the idea of burden means. Anyone who claims to know something owes a reason. You cannot be said to know something if you believe it without any reason whatsoever. Somebody says he knows, it's fair to ask him, why do you know? How do you know? If he says, I just know, then he's out of the discussion. You know, he's might as well go and play and have a cup of tea. Now, there are no free positions. There are no default positions. With nothing on the board, then I get to say I know X. And then we can start putting things on the board. No. So, if you think A is true, you need to present reason that it's true. If you think it's false, you need to present reason that it's false. If you have neither reason that it's true nor reason that it's false, then you should honestly confess your ignorance and simply say, I don't know whether it's true or false. Common sense is a kind of reason. It can be better in some contexts and worse in other contexts, and it'll all depend upon the particular issue that you're talking about. Yeah.
So, how did Jonathan, the son of Shaul, acquire the hay into his name?
I don't remember. Sorry. How he got the extra hay, Jonathan? I don't remember. Yeah, what's noch? What else is on people's minds? Yeah.
We say in the Sarat HaDibros that, not in the Sarat, the Sarat HaDibros that Hashem will punish the third or fourth generation. And then, I'm not sure exactly where, but we see it somewhere else that no man would die for another man's sins. So how do the two coincide?
Okay, the question I'm repeating it for the film is it says in the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. Don't say 10 commandments. That's wrong. That God will punish unto the third and fourth generations. And in another place it says that no man will die for another man's sin. If you look carefully, this is an interesting case in terms of textual fidelity. That phrase, the third and fourth generation, appears 4 times in the Torah. And twice it appears with the following additions. God preserves kindness for thousands of generations for those that love me, and punishes the third and fourth generation for those who hate me or are my enemies. So it's not willy-nilly. It's not automatically applied. Indeed, if it were automatically applied, you have an immediate contradiction. If the first generation is good and the second generation is bad, what does generation 3 get? Can't inherit both. So it means that the later generations have to continue the activities of the prior generations. So it's not that innocent people are being punished for someone else's crimes. Now you can ask, okay, but it does sound like there's going to be an increased punishment. One way to explain why there would be an increased punishment is that a first generation which adopts an evil policy may not be able to predict the consequences of that policy. They may not know the severity of what they're doing. But after the first generation sees the consequences and the second generation continues it, the second generation is worse than the first generation. They know more, and therefore they should be more responsible. Another way out is the Ramban's way out, and other Kabbalists who say that the reincarnation occurs most often within the first three subsequent generations, and that being the case, you are getting the same soul that actually performed the actions in the first generation. Both of those ways are possible. Yeah, everybody else is a spectator, hey? Yeah.
Is there any way to externally know, apart from the Torah, that Hashem's God's all powerful?
Is there any way to know, apart from the Torah, that God's all powerful? Well, I guess a lot depends on what you build into the idea of God. Are we taking him to be the creator?
Presumably.
Sorry?
So presumably.
Presumably, well, it'd be very difficult to put limits on the power of a creator. Power is an idea that we develop from within his creation. Power is energy, it's forces, it's resistance, it's inertia and mass, and so on. All of that is parts of the creation. He made the whole thing. So I don't know what the limits on power would be. You could talk about logic, are the things that he can't do in terms of pure logic. But it would be very difficult to say, maybe God can push a star or two around, but when it comes to a galaxy, that's beyond his ability. He's creating them out of nothing. He's giving them their existence. Right? What could possibly stand in his way? So I think that once you take the idea of God being creator, it's going to be very difficult to put a limit on the power to do things in the world which he's creating.
I know some people hope like an infinite life or something after the coming of the third phase of Hashem.
Infinite what, sorry?
Like an infinite life afterwards.
Infinite light?
I don't know, life, like afterlife or existence.
Oh, yeah. I mean eternal.
Eternal, yes.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I don't know if you hold that position. If you do, I'm wondering, would one not just exhaust all their goals and kind of, wouldn't life kind of be boring after that? I know like certain philosophers like Bernard Williams bring up that point. I'm not sure if that's a possibility or...
Okay, so the question is, if there's going to be eternal life, wouldn't it become boring, and wouldn't you exhaust all your goals, and so forth and so on? Now, first of all, I do want to point out, almost always, I'm not telling you what my position is. It would be really absurd for me to have a position. When I taught at Hopkins, I sometimes taught the Einstein-Bohr debates in relativity, in quantum mechanics, and the students would always ask, so who's right? I say, who are you asking? You're asking me who's right between Einstein and Bohr? I'm trying to enrich my life a little bit by understanding what they were talking about. So I'm not telling you my position. The question of boredom is raised by the Ramchal. And the Ramchal says something which in itself is quite astonishing. He says, in this world, when you do the same thing over and over and over again, it becomes boring. So therefore, in the world to come, that also is something that has to be answered. Gee, if he had said the opposite, if he had said, but this world and that world are so different from one another, can't bring any proofs one to the other, I'd have been very happy. And now he says this, I don't know why the next world has to be prefigured in this world, but he takes that for granted. But you have to understand what's going on in the next world. There's no action in the next world. There's no action. There's no free will. There's only experience. And the experience is fed to the soul, or the soul and body, to anybody, right? So it's just unending experience. Now, maybe one way to approach this idea is take a subject that you're interested in. Imagine unending new insights into that subject. It's not the same insights over and over again. There's new insights into that subject. If you enjoy the subject and you're getting new insights, is there any reason to think that you'll grow bored with new insights into a subject that you enjoy?
Is that possible for like eternity?
Well, I don't see why it wouldn't be. I mean, we're now playing with an idea about which we have no experience, and it's hard to project. For example, I happen to be a great fan of classical music. I can't imagine getting bored with Beethoven. That is, as long as I have Bach and Mozart and Berlioz and the rest to listen to from time to time, right? Nothing in my experience leads me to think that I would ever become bored with Beethoven. And if there was much more in Beethoven than I can at the moment appreciate, I'd be seeing new connections and hearing new things. I know when it happens to me now in a piece that I've heard 50 times, but I hear this twist, or a new performer will play a piece in a new way and reveal new nuances to it. This Sarah Chang plays the Brahms violin concerto. Heifetz plays the first movement in 17 minutes, and she plays it in 22 minutes. That's a big difference. She created a new experience, an entirely new experience. Never dreamt that it was there. So, and I'm thrilled by classical. I used to be a classical musician, so I'm thrilled by it. I can't imagine saying, yeah, but I'd rather go to count grains of sand. I'm sorry, I can't imagine that. There's no reason to think that's a problem. It is something like ever deepening insights into something that is a precious subject. And then it's not a question of goals or activities or anything else. Yeah.
My question is, any evil or wrongdoing that a person does in this world has to be finite to some degree, because this whole world is finite. So how could the consequences in the next world be infinite if at some point that will surpass the level of evil that was earned?
Why would, I'm lost a little bit. You're asking, since any evil that's done in this world would have to be finite because this world is finite.
Right.
Now, I suppose you're saying that should apply equally to good because any good done in this world also is finite because this world is finite.
I didn't put that part into the question because God giving extra good bothers me less than God giving extra punishment.
Oh, we didn't say anything about punishment. We didn't mention punishment. You're saying it now is the first time this evening that word has come up. The world to come is all good.
Okay.
Nothing other than good is there. All opinions that I'm aware of, whether Kabbalistic or philosophical or straight traditional, agree with that. So there's no punishment in the world to come. There's an initial phase in which certain accounts are settled, but the eternal world to come that he was talking about has none of that in it.
So even someone like Hitler would, his punishment, that initial phase would at a certain point run out?
Well, there is a big difference of opinion, sometimes even within the same author, as to whether certain souls are lost, just wink out of existence. Maimonides' position is that souls are lost, period. Nachmanides' position is that can't happen. Ramchal is on both sides of the page. In some places he says it can, in some places he says it can't. I've asked Ramchal's scholars how they deal with that, and they say we throw up our hands and don't deal with it. They don't have any way of making it consistent. They don't know whether he changed his mind, and which way he changed his mind. But so there is such an idea that a soul could not be represented in the world to come altogether. Even if it is represented in the world to come, it may be represented in such a way that its own integrity as an agent is lost. Some descriptions in the rabbinic literature would lead one to say that. So, but I think really the question that comes out of your words, which is maybe a more serious question, is since all the good that's done in this world is finite on the same grounds that you gave, if we're going to get a reward in the world to come, and it's a reward for the good that we have done, won't the reward at some point or other outrun the good that we have done to justify it? Which means in that case, from that point on, the reward isn't a reward, it's just a free gift. And there is a principle that the world to come should not be free gift. It should be earned. So how do you explain the earning of a good compensation or a good consequence? How do you explain of earning it on the basis of a finite input of merit, which generates an infinity of good consequences? That, I think, is a serious question. And I know one answer. I wouldn't say it's the only answer, but I do know one answer. Let's suppose that you work at a job and you're being paid. And you say, if you work at this job 40 hours a week, 48 weeks a year, and you work at it for 30 years, then you can retire, and we'll pay you a pension as long as you live. Well, that's interesting. While I'm working in the 30 years, do I get a salary? Oh, sure. Of course we'll pay you a salary. But in addition, we'll pay you a pension as long as you live. Does sound like I earned the salary during the 30 years that I was working, and then the pension I didn't earn. Okay, they took some of the value that you added to the company, and they invested that, and it produced extra profit, and therefore they're paying you for that. But the question arises whether you're being given a free gift or whether you've earned it. I think there's another model, a different model, where this question doesn't come up. Let's suppose that a person is building his own house in the forest. There are these naturists, who go back, they don't use electricity, they barely use hammer and nails, and they make hemp, and they tie things over in rope. And it takes him 10 years, and he builds this house. 10 years of hard work. And now he lives in the house. Would anyone say, let's see, you spent 10 years building a house, and now you've been living in it for 30 years. Well, 10 years of work, 30 years of residence, I guess you've sort of gotten the benefit out of what you invested on a fair compensation for your effort. Now move out, because you don't deserve to live there anymore. That doesn't sound right. I built the house, it's my house. If I live there for 60 years, or 80 years, or 100 years, I'm not taking something for nothing because I built the house. The way in which we get compensation in the world to come for what we do is not like getting paid money for a job. It's like reaping the benefits of creating something which then functions in the way that we created it. In particular, the thing that we are creating which functions is ourselves. We are self-creative. It's a famous verse. Interestingly, I haven't seen anybody make this point. Maybe it's just so obvious. Ela toldos Noach. These are the things that Noah created in the world. Noach ish tzadik tomim hoya b'dor osov. Noach was a righteous person, pure in his generations, as Elohim Salach Noach, and he walked with God. Now, the verse starts, these are Noach's productions, and the next word is Noach. These are Noach's productions. Noach and righteousness and purity and walking with God, but the first one is Noach. The verse is saying he's self-created. It's saying it's straight. Because the Kadosh Baruch Hu creates a human being with a lot of empty spaces, with certain abilities, yes, with certain proclivities, yes, with a lot of empty spaces. And when you perform an action, you not only affect the world around you, you affect yourself. You build something in yourself, or you inhibit something in yourself. In the end, your status in the world to come is what you have created in yourself. So the question of you put in so much effort and you created so much merit and you're running out of credit because you're receiving so much good doesn't apply if what you're assigned to do is build yourself in a certain way, and having built yourself in that way, you naturally have access to what's going on in the world to come. I think that's one way to see that there's not a discontinuity between the efforts that you perform and the merit that you have for getting what you get in the world to come. Yeah.
All right, so I have a question related to hashgacha. So, okay, the thing what I really want to know is if someone fulfills their purpose, like if someone is righteous like a tzaddik, or is like really strives to take on the most they can, I've heard the term hashgacha klalis, right, as it relates to this. So does the person who strives to be the most righteous they can be, are they more likely to be given, like small miracles from God? Is it a higher degree?
Okay, so your question is, if a person really strives to be the best person he can, in Jewish terms, is he more likely to see miracles from God? And you mentioned hashgacha, pratis, hashgacha, klalis, individual providence, general providence. So I want to make a couple of background remarks here because I think they're very important. I happen to be writing something on this subject at the present time. You do hear people talk about general providence, which is 4 categories, and where the individuals in the category are not the subject of the providence. You hear them talk about that. And sometimes they move in your direction. They talk about the fact that a person is a great tzaddik, very righteous, very pious, very godly, will merit individual providence, but the rest of us are treated as just members of a group. Well, if you're talking about human beings, that can't be right. That can't be right. First of all, reward and punishment makes that absolutely impossible. Reward and punishment means you are rewarded for your actions and punished for your actions individually. It's absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the group. Simply, you have a record, and your record determines the way in which God interacts with you. There are certain things that you can do to merit different treatment from God, certain types of mitzvah that you can do, or prayer, and that means that God is monitoring what you do, and that what you do plays a role in what happens to you afterwards. Maimonides, who was supposed to be the expositor of general providence and the laws of nature and all the rest, Maimonides writes in the guide that every pleasure, no matter how small and trivial, is a reward for some mitzvah that you did, and every pain, no matter how trivial, is a punishment for some transgression that you perform. Every pleasure and every pain. So that's individual providence in spades. When you think of your day, how many pleasures, oh, that was a good coffee. Or as the Rambam writes, you get a thorn in your finger, you pull it out. It's a matter of 3 seconds. No, you got a thorn in your finger, that's because of some transgression that you perform. So it's impossible to avoid the idea of individual providence. But your question in a way is more subtle than that, because whether you see a miracle or not depends upon what God wants for you and from you. And it might not go in gradations of righteousness. And indeed, Rav Dessler, where he talks about the kinds of efforts that people have to put into managing their affairs and how one should trust in God, a wonderful, wonderful essay. He has 5 categories of people, going from the most righteous, the most pious, the most successful spiritually, down to the least. And in his characterization, category 1 on the top can see miracles and even can command miracles. Category 2 never sees any miracles. And category 3 sometimes does see miracles. So it isn't in order of righteousness, in order of piety. It isn't that the more piety, the more likely you are to see miracles. No, it depends upon what God wants for your life, what God wants from your life. There are different stages in history. And whether you see miracles or not changes the quality of your free will. Just to take a simple example, the generation that left Egypt did not have the option of atheism. It just wasn't in the books. They saw too much. They were surrounded by miracles all the time. So the struggle, shall I believe in God or shall I be an atheist, and the arguments for and against, that struggle wasn't for them. It didn't exist for them. It couldn't exist. God wiped it out. Later on, there were periods with less miracles or no miracles, and then that struggle became a struggle. So God wants the struggle for different times. Doesn't mean you're better or worse on a higher or lower spiritual level. It's a different struggle. So that's, I think it's much more subtle. Whether you're likely to see miracles or not is much more subtle than just whether you're more spiritual or less spiritual, whether you're a better servant of God or a worse servant of God. There are many more variables than just that. That's a very crucial point. Ja, was noch?
You said that from the Rambam, every pain or every joy that a person experiences is because of his transgression or his mitzvah. So my question is, certain animals suffer more than other animals. Say an animal is abused or medical testing versus another animal is pampered their whole life. So how does that pain that they experience, how is that calculated by God in the same way? Or not necessarily the same way, but how is it calculated?
Well, how is it calculated? I mean, in the Guide for Perplexed, Maimonides considers at length 2 schools of Arabic philosophy, one of which says that an ant has is placed in the world to come, and if it gets squashed, somebody steps on it, it gets a very big reward in the world to come, and so forth and so on. And the Rambam says that definitely not the Torah view. The suffering of animals, so far as I can tell from, certainly from the Rambam and from the other writings, is of no moral significance whatsoever. So it's not something that has to be answered for. It is of no moral significance whatsoever. And when you say that there's a rule, Tzar Ba'alei Chaim, where we have to relieve the pain of animals, and by the way, that includes even animals you don't own. The Mishnah has a case of an animal that falls into a well, a wild animal that falls into a well, and it's a holiday, and you can do something to make sure it will you can save its life. You can do things to help it. It just doesn't belong to anybody. The Rambam is very clear, if you read everything he wrote, and so the others as well, that you're training yourself in compassion so that you'll treat people more compassionately. But there's no inherent value in treating animals compassionately. So as far as I know, the question in our system doesn't arise. Now, you could ask, I've asked this of myself as well, if I compare our system with the external intuitions, and they have very strong intuitions about human beings, about animal suffering, so how would I explain the difference, and could I communicate to them that they're making some kind of mistake? I haven't been able to figure that out yet. I don't have to communicate it to them. Maybe I can't communicate to them. Okay, so they made a mistake, which I can't disabuse them of. But you're asking about our system does not credit that. Yeah.
Is there a reason for animal suffering if no one was to witness that animal suffering and no one can help it? Just like if a tree falls on a deer in the forest and no one's there and that deer suffers, what's the reason as to why it has to suffer?
It's a good question. What would be the reason if it doesn't have any effect on human life? I don't know the answer in this particular case, but I will just remind you that we have a history of discovering connections that we never dreamt existed. You ask somebody 400 years ago, the plankton on the surface of the ocean are undergoing a blight, and him saying, that's great, the ships will slide through with less resistance, we can lower shipping rates and so forth and so on. They're at the bottom of the food chain, if they go down, then the fish go down, and then the animals go down, and then we all go down. Yeah, but they don't know that. They don't know how it's connected. The chlorofluorocarbons, which were such a terrible problem, until we got rid of them, right? So you expel them in your spray. They all go to over Antarctica and create a hole in the ozone layer, that we were told then. How do they know to go south? Why don't they go north? Why do they distribute them? Who knows? I mean, the world is connected in ways that are very, very difficult to even imagine. So to say that something happens and has no effect on what's going on in the rest of the world, very hard to say with any authority. And I'll give you an extreme example, just to show you how far this might go. I'll just take a few minutes to teach you something out of the history of science. Maybe you have heard of the idea of a Gedanken experiment. A Gedanken experiment means you think up something that might happen, and you ask yourself, what will happen under these conditions? You figure it out, and then you think, well, boy, how's the world built that this kind of thing happens? You don't actually do it in practice. Einstein was famous of thinking, he was the fall in the elevator, if the elevator fell and you were in the elevator, what would you experience? If I were riding with a light beam, what would I see? So the most famous of them all is Sir Isaac Newton's bucket experiment. We think of motion as relative. Are you moving right now? Well, not with respect to the table, but with respect to the sun you're moving, because you're on the earth, and the earth is moving with respect to the sun. So when you ask something moving, what you really mean is there motion between this and something else? And when you pick the something else, you might get a yes answer. Pick a different something else, you get a no answer. Motion is relative. It's a relationship between a thing and other things. It isn't a property that the thing itself has. That was the standard idea. Newton thought he had a proof that that's not correct. And here's his proof. He said, take a bucket half full of water, take the handle of the bucket, tie a rope to it, and hang the rope from a tree, so the bucket's hanging in midair. Wind the bucket, wind the rope, and let it go. The bucket's going to spin. Now imagine we miniaturize you, and you're sitting on the lip of the bucket. So you're going round and around and around. You look up, and you see the world going around and around and around the other direction. So now, what's happening? Am I going round and round and round and it's stationary? Am I stationary? It's going round and round the other direction? 50-50? According to relative motion, they're all equal statements. Things move with respect to other things. Something's changing in my relationship to the rest of the world, and it's changing. That's all there is to say. That's the standard that he was fighting against. Now Newton said, look down. Look down into the bucket. What are you going to see? You're going to see the water creeping up the sides of the bucket. What's called centrifugal force, which isn't the force. Yes, we know about inertia. Okay, fine. Right, we can do physics some other time. You see the water creeping up the side of the bucket. He said, that shows you that it's the bucket that's moving and not the rest of the world. Because only the bucket's motion is going to push the water up the sides of the bucket. The rest of the world isn't going to do that. That was his proof for something called absolute space and absolute motion. That became, like everything else that Newton wrote, became gospel until the 19th century, when I think it was Maxwell who said, I don't believe it. I think it's the relative motion of the bucket to the rest of the world that's doing it. And if you erased all the skies from the heavens, the water wouldn't go up. It's not the bucket by itself that's doing it. It's the bucket with respect to the rest of the world. All motion is relative. So when you play ping pong, thank the stars. Because without the stars, the ball's not going to bounce. It's not going to happen. Wow. So all those stars out there are making it possible to play baseball. Without them, something wouldn't work. No one dreamt that all those stars are doing something for us. So when you hear discoveries like that, you think, how much do we know? how much do we know about how things are connected? It's very hard to say. So to say definitively when such and such a thing happens, could it have an effect? And to try to explain, since we know it doesn't have an effect, therefore we have to justify it somehow, I think that's going out on a limb. So I would just urge caution with questions like that. By the way, I've asked people whether Maxwell's principle is expressed in Einstein's equations or not, and I've gotten the very interesting answer, it's not clear. Not clear whether Einstein is using Maxwell's principle or not. That's some of the interesting subtleties of science that they probably don't teach you in your physics class. Ja, was noch?
This might not be like the best question, but what was the point of creating, let's say, like the other planets if like humans would never be able to experience it?
Well, I think it's similar to what we were saying before, but maybe now we can say more. Well, imagine that it would be impossible to go to the bed of the ocean. Would you say there was no purpose to creating the bed of the ocean because it's connected, right? It's probably next to impossible to go to the center of the earth, mostly because it's much too hot, and you're not going to be able to protect yourself against the heat. But that heat generates upwards and has effects on the surface of the earth. So when you ask for a purpose for something, you have to take into account all the indirect effects that a thing can have. Now, one of the indirect effects the thing has is on observers. People who look at it and try to figure things out and draw conclusions, that's also an effect. So I'll tell you something very interesting that Maimonides has in the guide. There's a lot of talk today about intelligent design, inferences from order and design in nature. And the inference is supposed to be when you see order and design, there must be a designer, which isn't stupid, even though Richard Dawkins said so, but it isn't stupid at all. The Rambam has an opposite argument. He has design on the basis of disorder, lack of order, confusion. Because in the Rambam's thought system, when you want to explain something in the world, there are two possibilities. Either it's natural or it's created. And nature has certain characteristics. Nature, he says, is what always happens or almost always happens. And nature is ordered in such a way that you have a reasonable explanation for why things happen the way they do. So, a big stone falling into a body of water creates a big wave. And a little stone creates a little wave. It could be orderly, but if the big stone created a little tiny ripple, and the little stone created a big wave, it would be orderly, but it would be inexplicable. Why should such a big displacement of water be caused by a tiny little pebble? And why should a gigantic rock cause only a little ripple? You wouldn't be able to explain why it was so. Now, the Rambam's taking the position of Aristotle and his followers as to how the heavens work. You see the motions of the planets and the stars, and they are regular motions, and they are accounted for by the fact that there are bodies in the heavens that carry the planets and carry the stars, and they move in certain ways, and that accounts for the motion of these planets and stars. And they're called the spheres. And there are different systems of spheres, 9 spheres, 22 spheres, 47 spheres, and as Maimonides points out, the official position in astronomy is some move from east to west, and some move from west to east. Some move more slowly, some move more rapidly. The Earth is not in the center of all the spheres. That's what the word, you've heard the word eccentric? It doesn't just mean queer. It means out of the center, eccentric. So in other words, some of the spheres that go around the Earth, where the Earth's inside the sphere, but not necessarily at the center, right? Now he asks, is there any order to the spheres that gives you an explanation for what they do. Is it that the lower ones go faster and the higher ones go slower? No, it isn't. Is it that the ones that go from east to west go faster and the ones that west to east go slower? No, it isn't. There's no order to the motions of the spheres. Maimonides says, from this observation, you could draw the conclusion there must be a creator. Because there are only two possibilities. Either it's nature or it's a creator. This isn't natural. And he says that when Isaiah tells you to raise your eyes to the heavens and gaze and see who created these, that's what he's talking about. Take a look, study astronomy, you'll see it's disorderly, and from this you conclude there must be a creator of these things. Nature, according to the idea that Maimonides is working with, nature is something that's necessary, a necessity built into it. But a necessity built into it, it's an Aristotelian idea. By the way, the Rambam took nothing from Aristotle. He used what he agreed with, what he himself was convinced was right on the basis of rational argument. For Rambam, Aristotle has no authority. It's very, very important. There's no authority whatsoever. And therefore he opposes Aristotle in some things. And here he says, he thinks Aristotle knew this, that his attempt to explain the heavens naturally was a failure. And he said if he had followed his thought logically to the end, instead of believing that the world was infinitely old with no changes and necessary and natural, he would have been drawn the correct conclusion that it must be created. And that's what Isaiah says. So here's something which the planets could do, not because we get minerals from them, not because they cause the rain, but because looking at them could teach us something very important. That's not nothing. Here's another thing Rav Dester says. I mean, you look around at our world, now of course people don't believe this anymore, but that's because they're tainted by politics. There's too much of everything. There's too much air, there's too much water, there's too much food, there's too much land, there's too much of everything. Sure, we destroy some of it and waste it, but even that, you go fill the Sahara Desert with people and tell me when you'll be finished. It's hard? Yeah, it might be hard. It might be expensive, but it's not impossible. It's not like we're running out of land or running out of any of these resources. So he said, what do you learn from that? That if you don't have, it's not because God ran out. Not because he lacks it, because he decided you shouldn't have. Not because he had limited resources. So, I mean, there are lots of things you can learn from observing the world. Seeing that there's too much of everything teaches you something very important about how God runs the world. And I think on this level, there's really no end to what you could get. Yeah.
If I was understanding your previous argument correctly, if Rambam says that the chaos is almost necessary when it comes to nature, how can that position also be compatible with the position that God created things? Wouldn't it then make sense to say that nature is contingent on God instead of it being a necessary thing?
I didn't use the word chaos once. Let me give you a piece of advice. If you have to raise a question or express an objection to a person's position and you have to use a word or concept that he didn't use, you might be in trouble. I didn't use the word chaos. So maybe...
Did you use maybe I mixed it up?
No, I said it was not ordered.
Not ordered, my apologies.
Yeah, it's not orderly in the way that nature is orderly. Now, I didn't say it was independent. Also, I didn't say anything. All I said was that if you have a background assumption that everything is either natural or created, and nature has certain characteristics, in particular, one of them is order, and you find something where your best thinker's description of it isn't orderly, then the conclusion you ought to draw is that it's created. Now, what's the objection supposed to be?
Okay, maybe I misunderstood it. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Okay. Yeah.
How come traditionally I've always had that Judaism is very against looking into philosophers, whereas true philosophy is just a search for truth? What would be the objection to that?
Well, Jewish tradition isn't against philosophy or philosophers. It's against particular ideas. We have our own philosophical ideas. I can just give you an example of Shimon Shkop in the Shara Yashar. This is Shar Daled Perik Beis. Asks the following question: you're not allowed to steal other people's property, right? The Torah prohibits stealing other people's property. Now, how does it go? Is it that Kodesh Baruch Hu tells you, these and these things, and these conditions, don't take. And then you say, aha, these are the things which I'm not allowed to take, so that's what property is. Kodesh Baruch Hu is defining for me property by telling me what I can't take. The prohibition against taking comes first, and the concept of property comes second, or the other way around. People have property. Kodesh Baruch Hu says, don't take their property. Which is it? So he says, it's the second way. Property comes first, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, don't take their property, which means we're leaving property undefined for the moment. And he gives the following parallel. He says, many Sforim tell us that one of the motivations for keeping the mitzvos, listen carefully, keeping the mitzvos, all of them, is gratitude for what the Kodesh Baruch Hu gives us. You picture a person saying, I hear your system, I see it, I see all these rules. What reason do I have for abiding by the system, living by the system? The answer is, the Kodesh Baruch Hu gives you an enormous amount of good, and that creates an obligation on you to abide by the system. Now ask yourself, where does the obligation to pay debts of gratitude come from? The obligation to pay debts of gratitude can't come from the system. Because if it came from the system, it couldn't be a reason for accepting the whole system. So there's got to be an obligation to pay debts of gratitude which is external and prior to the system as a whole. That's a very philosophical proposition. That's the kind of thing that philosophy talks about, right? So here it's in the context of a legal argument, and then it draws it out to a context of a religious principle. Religion is using philosophy all the time. Not all parts of philosophy, not all parts of philosophy equally, but using philosophical thought all the time. Now, I'll just add one more remark about this. In philosophy, I was a professional philosopher, you divide philosophy into pure philosophy and you could call it applied philosophy. Applied philosophy is what we call philosophy of law, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of political philosophy, was the philosophy of social groups and their dynamics and so forth and so on. Philosophy of means taking a philosophical style of thinking and applying it to a going concern, a thing that's already in existence and functioning and operating, and asking, what are its general principles? Are they consistent with one another? Are there alternatives that could have been used? How do these general principles fit with other general principles? That's the kind of thing that philosophy would ask. How do you define the basic concepts? In political philosophy, what is property? In the Gemara, what is a kinyan? What is something an act of taking possession? What is a kinyan? What kind of thing is it? What does it do? What are its dynamics? What are its conditions? These kinds of questions are philosophical questions, which profound thinkers in every field raise and ask, and they're just the philosophy of that field. That's going on in our subjects all the time. Then there are three branches of philosophy which are supposed to stand independently, prior to the world and independently of the world. One is epistemology, the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? One is metaphysics. What are the things in the world? What are the categories, basic categories, how they relate to one another? And another thing which could be called value theory, like ethics and aesthetics, things that are right or wrong, good or evil, just or unjust, better and worse, right? And there, you're not facing an ongoing project. You're supposedly standing outside of the whole system, looking at it abstractly and trying to figure out what its basic dynamics are. That is something which is questionable, controversial. It's very not clear at all what the methodology is supposed to be for arriving at conclusions, what kind of argumentation should be used. There's something which has become popular since John Rawls called reflective equilibrium, but not everybody agrees. And there, I think, Jewish sources would have much less sympathy for that kind of reasoning. But using philosophical reasoning within a particular area to define and organize and analyze its basic properties and basic propositions, I think that's something that goes on in Jewish Jewish study all the time. There's nothing, yeah.
When it comes to the social sciences, do we say that, do we we look for answers outside of the Torah when it comes to the social sciences, let's say.
Social sciences. Well, I certainly won't say that that's an oxymoron, having just said it. And I'm inclined to be sympathetic to those who are quite critical of the so-called social sciences. But look, economics is one of the social sciences, and there are supposed to be laws of economics which determine. These are laws of supply and demand. The Torah is going to say yes or no to the law of supply and demand. I mean, this is a description of what people do, and either it's correct or it isn't correct. I think it will depend upon the particular question at hand and how sensitive it is. Psychology is very sensitive because psychology gives a description of what the essential human being is. And I think I can safely say that for every psychological theory that has ever been concocted, they're all dead wrong. They're all dead wrong. They're not getting what a human being is. Maybe we don't have a picture of it either because it's beyond having a picture of, but they're certainly wrong. And that's very dangerous because if you have a wrong picture of what a human being is, that's going to lead you to wrong priorities and wrong projects and wrong self-evaluation and wrong requirements of responsibility. It's going to lead you in terrible directions. Yeah, economics is more economics is something where you have some data to work with and some levels where you could possibly describe what things are happening, what things are done, and have something useful from it. There's something called, with this I'm going to end because I have to teach another class upstairs, but there's something called microeconomics. And microeconomics actually proves theorems about economic behavior. The trouble is they have to make an assumption that people are rational consumers. But of course they aren't. They make all sorts of rational mistakes in the way in which they pursue the world. Amartya Sen was famous for criticizing, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, famous for criticizing microeconomics on the grounds that the theorems that you're proving don't apply to real people. And the answer he got back was, yeah, but if we don't assume that they're rational consumers, we can't prove any theorems. That was the answer. So, okay, fine, gotcha. Okay, go ahead to prove some more theorems. Okay. So could there be approximations? Well, yes or no. Take a look and see. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Okay.